The General Services Administration is an independent agency of the United States government, established in 1949 to help manage and support the basic functioning of federal agencies. The GSA supplies products and communications for U.S. government offices, provides transportation and office space to federal employees, and develops government-wide cost-minimizing policies and other management tasks. GSA employs about 12,000 federal workers and has an annual operating budget of roughly $26.3 billion. GSA oversees $66 billion of procurement annually. It contributes to the management of about $500 billion in U.S. federal property, divided chiefly among 8,300 owned and leased buildings and a 210,000 vehicle motor pool. Among the real estate assets managed by the GSA are the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center in Washington, D.C., the largest U.S. federal building after the Pentagon, and the Hart-Doland OI Federal Center. GSA's business lines include the Federal Acquisition Service and the Public Buildings Service. Other divisions include the Office of Government-Wide Policy, and various staff offices, including the Office of Small Business Utilization, the Office of Civil Rights, and the Office of Citizen Services and Communications. The official U.S. government web portal, USA.gov, and the Spanish-language web portal to U.S. government services, gobiernusa.gov, are members of the Office of Citizen Services and Communications family of websites, which also includes pueblo.gsa.gov, kids.gov, consumeraction.gov, and webcontent.gov. The GSA is member of the Procurement G6, an informal group leading the use of framework agreements and e-procurement instruments in public procurement. History. In 1947, President Harry Truman asked former President Herbert Hoover to lead what became known as the Hoover Commission to make recommendations to reorganize the operations of the federal government. One of the recommendations of the commission was the establishment of an Office of the General Services. This proposed office would combine the responsibilities of the following organizations: U.S. Treasury Department's Bureau of Federal Supply, U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Contract Settlement, National Archives establishment, all functions of the Federal Works Agency, including the Public Buildings Administration and the Public Roads Administration, War Assets Administration. GSA became an independent agency on July 1, 1949, after the passage of the Federal Property and Administrative Services Act. General Jess Lassen, administrator of the War Assets Administration, was named GSA's first administrator. The first job awaiting Administrator Lassen and the newly formed GSA was a complete renovation of the White House. The structure had fallen into such a state of disrepair by 1949 that one inspector of the time said the historic structure was standing purely from habit. Lassen later explained the nature of the total renovation in depth by saying, "In order to make the White House structurally sound, it was necessary to completely dismantle, and I mean completely dismantle, everything from the White House except the four walls, which were constructed of stone. Everything, except the four walls without her roof, was finally stripped down. And that's where the work started." GSA worked closely with President Truman and First Lady Bess Truman to ensure that the new agency's first major project would be a success. GSA completed the renovation in 1952. Gsa Headquarters, located at 18th and F Streets, NW, was U.S. General Services Administration building listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1986 as Interior Department offices. In 1985, the National Archives and Records Administration was part of GSA until it was made an independent agency. In July 1991, GSA contractors began the excavation of what is now the Ted Vice Federal Building in New York City. The planning for that building did not take into account the possibility of encountering the historic cemetery for colonial-era African New Yorkers that was located beneath the footprint of the $276 million office building. When initial excavation disturbed burials, destroying skeletons and artifacts, GSA sent archaeologists to excavate, but hid their findings from the public. Revelation of the discoveries led to 18 months of activism by African descendant community members, public officials, academics, and concerned citizens. Ultimately, GSA made public amends by funding extensive scientific research under the auspices of Michael Blakey, creating a new sub-agency, the Office of Public Education and Interpretation, truncating the building plan, and funding public reports on the story of the African burial ground. The efforts led to the creation of a new unit of the National Park Service, the African Burial Ground National Monument, at the facility. GSA fully funded that portion of the National Park Service until 2010, when GSA's formal involvement with the African Burial Ground ceased. In 2003, the Federal Protective Service was moved to the Department of Homeland Security. In 2005, GSA reorganized to merge the Federal Supply Service and Federal Technology Service business lines into the Federal Acquisition Service. On April 3, 2009, President Barack Obama nominated Martha N. Johnson to serve as the GSA administrator. After a 9-month delay, the United States Senate confirmed her nomination on February 4, 2010. On April 2, 2012, Johnson resigned in the wake of a management deficiency report that detailed improper payments for a 2010 Western Regions training conference put on by the Public Buildings Service in Las Vegas. It stated that PBS Regions 7, 8, 9, and 10 had been holding WRCs since the early 1990s. Before turning in her own resignation, Johnson fired 2 other GSA senior executives, PBS head Robert Peck and senior advisor Stephen Leeds. 4 PBS regional commissioners, who had been responsible for planning the conference, were placed on administrative leave. The conference had been the most recent in a series of similar lavish conferences organized by regions of GSA's Public Buildings Service. In previous years, Western Regions conferences had been in New Orleans, Oklahoma City, San Antonio, and Lake Tahoe, U.S. Representative John Mica, chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, called for a congressional investigation into the misuse of federal money by GSA. In an earlier scandal, President George W. Bush had forced a previous GSA administrator, Lurita Doan, to resign. GSA had awarded a sole source contract for $20,000 to her friend. Doan appeared to have violated the Hatch Act. Organization structure. Or GSA consists of 2 major services: the Public Buildings Service and the Federal Acquisition Service. The Administrator of General Services is the chief executive of the agency. Daniel Tang-Herlini was named as acting administrator on April 2, 2012 and was succeeded by Denise Turner Roth on 23 February 2015. In addition to the 2 major services, the agency also includes the Office of Government-Wide Policy, which has policy-making authority in the areas of personal and real property, travel and transportation, information technology, regulatory information and use of federal advisory committees, and includes the Office of Acquisition Policy, which carries out acquisition management under the guidance of the Chief Acquisition Officer and the Senior Procurement Executive. Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings, which assists GSA and customer agencies in reducing the economic and environmental footprint of federal buildings. Office of Asset and Transportation Policy, which develops government-wide policies and guidance to achieve economical and effective management processes for government assets. Office of Committee and Regulatory Management, which includes the Committee Management Secretariat, which develops government-wide policies, guidance, performance measures, regulations, and training on the management and operation of federal advisory committees, and the Regulatory Information Service Center, which gathers and publishes information about federal regulations and their effect on society. Office of Information, Integrity, and Access, which develops, coordinates, and defines information technology business strategies. Office of Executive Councils, which collaborates with Office of Management and Budget and Federal Management Councils to identify government-wide performance improvement initiatives, including the Chief Acquisition Officers Council, previously the Procurement Executives Council, and the Federal Acquisition Council, consists of federal acquisition professionals and provides a senior-level forum for monitoring and improving the federal acquisition system. Chief Financial Officers Council, an organization of the Chief Financial Officers and Deputy Chief Financial Officers which advises and coordinates the activities of the member agencies. Chief Information Officers Council, the principal interagency forum on federal agency practices for IT management. Performance Improvement Council, which is composed of the performance improvement officers of federal agencies and departments as well as senior OMB officials. And the President's Management Council, which is composed of chief operating officers of major federal government agencies and advises the President and OMB on government reform initiatives. Office of the Inspector General, and Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, an independent tribunal which hears and decides contract disputes between government contractors and the GSA and other executive agencies. Regions. GSA conducts its business activities through 11 offices throughout the United States, located in Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Denver, FD, Worth, Kansas City, Missouri, New York City, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. GSA also provides specific services out of the central office for nationwide programs.